Ukraine has carried out mechanized attacks and neutralized several months of Russian gains. In this video, we want to talk about that. How did Ukraine achieve this? Is this the major Ukrainian counteroffensive? And what can we expect as a result? All of that in this video. Holy smokes! Save the most at Holy now with my code. After Ukraine initially carried out attacks roughly between Pokrovsky and Huljapole, attacks are now also being reported from the area south of the city of Zaporizhzhia. Here we have the Russian mill blogger Ryba, who writes about the attacks taking place to the south. And we can see on maps that the Ukrainian attacks are advancing several kilometers in some areas. To quote the Russian mill bloggers themselves, here are their statements. The situation on the western flank of the front near Zaporizhzhia has dramatically worsened in the last 24 hours. The enemy is trying to cut off the advance towards Zaporizhzhia along the bank of the former Kakhovka reservoir. The Ukrainian armed forces have launched an offensive along a section about 20 kilometers wide. The intensified airstrikes by the enemy, targeting the lines of communication, pose an additional challenge. So, we hear that the Ukrainians are attacking on a broad front. They are trying to cut off the Russian troops by basically advancing in this direction. And the Ukrainian Air Force is active. Even in the fourth year of the war, or almost the fourth year of the war, the Russians are still unable to stop Ukrainian air activity. What's important here is that Ukraine is deploying its assault brigades, meaning elite units that are currently advancing. We want to put all of this into context. So far, Ukraine has not broken through enemy lines. Conventional fronts practically no longer exist. It's not like there's currently a trench along the entire Russian front that Ukrainian troops have crossed. Rather, we have to understand it as individual strongpoints on both sides. In between, there's sometimes a wide zone of 10 kilometers, and sometimes even more than 10 kilometers, where the positions of both sides overlap and are effectively mixed together. Often, there are soldiers who don't shoot at enemies at all, but only report the presence of the enemy to their own troops so that they can be targeted by drones. That means there are reports that Ukrainian, but of course also Russian soldiers, are in a house and see enemy soldiers passing by. And they don't shoot at them, but report them so they can be targeted. That is the current reality over kilometers of front between both sides. On the Russian side, this is the result of infiltration tactics, where small groups, usually no more than 3 soldiers, advance and then survive the drone attacks. They take cover somewhere, and ideally, they regroup there, join up with other survivors, and then continue advancing. And in this way, they can capture a Ukrainian position or cut off Ukrainian supply lines. Of course, this often leads to contact between troops from both sides. And when enemy positions are observed, they are engaged either by the infiltration troops themselves if they spot the enemy, or they are eliminated by air support called in by the Russian infiltration troops. That is, either with glide bombs or with drones. On the Ukrainian side, however, there are only small outposts, often little more than 2 men. On the one hand, of course, because the Ukrainian side has a shortage of infantry. There simply aren't enough troops to heavily occupy every front position. And on the other hand, troop concentrations are highly vulnerable to glide bombs, which still wipe out every detected strong Ukrainian position. If the Ukrainians have a position deep underground where the drones can't really reach, then the Russians use glide bombs and wipe out the entire position. This leads to more or less a transitional area between both sides, where both sides have more troop concentration toward their own lines. We can imagine it like a patchwork quilt, where there are actually Russian positions behind the Ukrainian ones and vice versa. And it's a patchwork, with little spots everywhere, and sometimes nothing at all in between. The Russian side relies on drones providing fire support to their units, and of course the Ukrainian side does as well. The reconnaissance drones, when they make Ukrainian operations impossible, it's them that make Ukrainian operations impossible. The Russian reconnaissance drones immediately detect any movement on the Ukrainian side, and then they attack using artillery and drones. But that depends on a short kill chain, meaning the brief time between identifying the target and actually attacking it. And until a few days ago, Starlink was indispensable for the Russians here, because it provided a broadband connection practically from anywhere along the front, allowing unlimited live streams from reconnaissance drones at all levels. so that they were available at various positions. Each artillery position can live stream their shelling and make real-time corrections. It no longer needs a forward observer. It can use its weapons just as effectively directly. And the coordination between reconnaissance, decision-making, targeting, and the actual strike is made possible. And, above all, accelerated with these means. And that has enabled the Russians to have an effective kill chain. The fact that Starlink has shut down the Russians, meaning that the Russian Starlink no longer works, has completely destroyed this system. Of course, the Russians won't be able to set up thousands of radio bridges or even lay cables overnight. Alternatives are basically possible. We've already mentioned radio bridges or cables, at least largely possible, because these methods are much more complicated, and that's why they haven't been used so far. The Russians don't have Starlink, fundamentally. Building these, setting up these chains, will of course take time, and that already starts with purchasing the equipment. It's not like thousands of Wi-Fi radio bridges have been stored in sufficient numbers 30 kilometers behind the front. If you want to buy and store equipment, you can do so with today's sponsor and their offer. Oli has a special for Carnival, the limited Holy Energy Cola Camela with the flavor of the classic raspberry candy, just like the ones you know from Carnival. There's also a thermo or a plastic shaker with the first one. The best deal is definitely the Football Club Köln pack with Cola Camela and the first Football Club Köln thermo shaker. That costs 64.99 euros. And with my code Heinrich, you get another 10% discount. That also puts you over the 50 euro purchase value, which means you get the fan scarf for free as well. So enjoy Holy Cola Camela and save 10% with the code Heinrich. And of course, you also support the channel. The fact that the Russians no longer had access to Starlink has now been opportunistically exploited by the Ukrainians. First, between Pokrovsky and Huljapole, roughly in this area. The Ukrainians launched attacks and took positions mainly here. Now, activity has also taken place roughly between Zaporizhzhia and Orikhiv. Here too, the Ukrainians are now attacking. Because of the collapse of the kill chain, the Ukrainians can now concentrate their troops a bit more, since the risk is reduced. And in Russian infiltration positions, there are usually only 1 to 3 Russian soldiers, so that's a huge difference. Will the Ukrainians now suddenly dare to attack with 2 infantry fighting vehicles and 10 to 15 men? That gives them a drastic advantage, of course, and allows them to minimize their own losses against the Russian soldiers while effectively taking action against them at the same time. However, the Russians still have reconnaissance drones, as well as artillery and first-person view drones. But due to the lack of Starlink, the Russians are now slower to respond to Ukrainian attacks. And that opens a window in which the Ukrainians can operate, even with somewhat larger troops, before they are effectively engaged. The Ukrainians are acting deliberately in the contested area, which must be understood. We're mainly talking about the area near the front, where both sides haven't entrenched themselves deeply, as we can see here. That's where the Ukrainians are mainly taking action. The infiltrated Russian troops are being defeated with limited counterattacks that specifically clear certain areas. And afterwards, in this way, Ukrainian control is restored. The Ukrainians benefit from the fact that the Russians don't have consolidated control. So they haven't planned any minefields or defensive positions, because the whole situation is a fluid transition. There isn't a real front line that would be strong enough to directly stop the Ukrainians. The soldiers, of course, rarely take anti-tank missiles with them during infiltration attacks, which makes it easier for the Ukrainians when they move through with mechanized forces. But what's important is that we currently don't see any breakthrough operations. We don't see a Ukrainian attempt to roll up the entire front and push deep into the rear area. So, let's move on to the assessment. At the current time, the full extent is not completely clear. In the pro-Ukrainian camp, there are claims that the whole thing is much bigger, but it's being kept secret. Personally, I'm quite undecided about these statements, because based on how things happened, it seems more like they took advantage of an opportunity rather than it being a planned offensive. Because this should have happened at the same time as the shutdown. Really down to the minute? That would have been the most effective, of course. The first Russian units already have alternatives now. At other locations, at least the radios have been distributed. Things that were neglected before. That means, with every hour, the Russians improved their response to the shutdown of Starlink. And to wait for weeks with such an offensive simply makes no sense. From my point of view, this suggests that it wasn't a planned major offensive that was supposed to be coordinated with the shutdown of Starlink. Instead, they're reacting to it ad hoc now, to a window of time and opportunity that has opened up as a result. The Ukrainians can definitely take advantage of the fragmented front line. We must also be clear that these Ukrainian attacks do come with losses. Russian drones and artillery still exist, even if reaction times are longer and coordination is lower. They will go a bit further, but they won't be as expansive, like the Balaklia offensive in 2022, where the Ukrainians drove the Russians out of Kharkiv, crossed the Oskil, and advanced far to the east, even towards Luhansk. We shouldn't expect that. I don't think that's going to happen. In general, the Russians will eventually get their communications under control and their current. They will certainly start soon, if they haven't already, to lay mines in front of the current artillery impact positions. This means that with every hour, it will become harder for the Ukrainians to advance. That means trying to interpret this as a general turning point in the war would be wrong, but it is still important. Of course, that should not be left unmentioned. Even if the attacks reach their climax in 5 days, and the Ukrainians do not advance further after that, has Ukraine demonstrated something to Russia? And that's the point. At that point, the Ukrainians may have nullified the Russian gains of half a year. And that, in just 2 weeks, they themselves with a few hundred losses, while the Russians have suffered tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of losses in the same period. And of course, that is also of tremendous importance from a moral standpoint. We have to clearly say that it will massively strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position with the United States of America. And that's important for that reason alone, because the Ukrainians are showing the Americans, especially the American president, that they are by no means on the ropes, that they do not have to capitulate at any cost. And the moment that is understood by the American side, the pressure itself should also shift, and that will improve the Ukrainian position. Furthermore, and this is probably one of the most important insights from this, it shows that with technological superiority, a return to maneuver warfare is at least theoretically possible. In the video from yesterday, which I will link for you here, I showed you a clip where a prototype demonstrates how drones can be fought, fully automatically and AI controlled. If we see this in serial production on every Ukrainian vehicle, and significantly before the Russians, then such a movement can suddenly gain much more momentum, and the Ukrainians can act much more confidently. So we see, it's by no means the case that Ukraine has already been defeated or beaten, but we shouldn't overinterpret this as the turning point of the war. The signs for that aren't there yet, and the offensive activities are probably still too limited. As I said, it's more about this. The contested area. In the gray zone, in this one here. What we see here, in these areas where the Russians haven't entrenched themselves, to drive them out of these areas, to defeat them there, that's a completely different task. If the Ukrainians wanted to advance further south somehow, we're definitely not talking about that at this point. And that's it for the situation report here. If you liked it, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. That helps me with the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. On Wednesday at 8 p.m. German time, the next livestream will cover the war in Ukraine, including a situation report. There will also be a Q&A session where you can of course address such topics. And in the next few days, there should be another video about Iran. A lot has happened there as well. We will cover that here on the channel in the future. Otherwise, I would like to thank you for your attention and see you soon. Thanks to both Patreon supporters and YouTube members. In particular, I would like to thank Lieutenant Colonels Mahamuri and Thomas Komps, as well as Lieutenants Vision, Soundlab, Robert Veal, Matt Burke Muta 1000 Biertainment, Janis Gu NTX, Sascha Müller, Cunningham European Union Stress, Jans vom Eck Uwe, Die Fremen, Nickname Tubib, Carsten Schulz, Gulasch Nasher 4000 and Tequila 42. Thank you. This wouldn't be possible without them.